It wasn't the first time I had been told I was no longer needed. This time, though, it felt different. Jason, my boss, walked into my office, his face already set in that look he always wore when he was about to deliver bad news. "Arya," he said, "we need to talk." I could already tell. It was never a good sign when he said my full name. In that moment, I could feel the weight of the decision hovering in the air. "You're fired," he said flatly, without even a hint of emotion. I didn't flinch. Not because I wasn't shocked, but because I knew this was coming and I knew exactly how this was going to unfold. This was about the new startup the company had been pouring resources into, a product they thought was the next big thing. A project that had been quickly losing ground to technical failure, and of course, my department was blamed. It wasn't that I couldn't fix the problem. It was that I knew exactly what was going to happen, and Jason, like so many others in leadership, misunderstood the most important thing. I wasn't just the IT girl fixing systems. I was the one keeping the whole building's infrastructure running silently in the background. They hadn't even realized yet that without me, the startup they were rushing to launch wouldn't even get off the ground. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear how the smallest decisions can bring down a startup, how power isn't always visible, and how silence can become the most powerful form of revenge. I stood up from my desk, calmly packed my things, and walked out of the office. Jason didn't even notice. He was already talking to someone else on the phone. But as I walked past the sleek glass walls of the conference room, I saw it all falling apart. The startup they had pinned all their hopes on was built on the very foundation I had crafted. And it would all come down. Quietly. I wasn't the face of the startup. I wasn't part of the daily pitch meetings or the glossy presentations to investors. I was the one behind the scenes, ensuring the infrastructure was solid and visible, but essential. Jason's team was obsessed with speed, with getting the product to market as quickly as possible. They didn't want to hear about systems, about testing, about long-term stability. They wanted results, and they wanted them now. The startup they were banking on wasn't just a new product. It was the lifeblood of the company's future, their ticket to a multi-million-dollar valuation. But no one had bothered to check if the foundation was strong enough to hold the weight. I built that foundation, and I knew it better than anyone. I had designed the entire tech infrastructure, from the servers to the cloud architecture to the backup systems they depended on. Without me, the whole thing would collapse. Jason didn't know this yet, but the decisions he was making now were about to unravel everything I had silently kept in place. I didn't blame him. He was too caught up in the excitement of the startup world, the chase for growth and scalability. But I also knew this. The systems they had in place were fragile, and one misstep could bring everything down. I'd warned him about it. I had sent memos. I had shown him reports. But he hadn't listened. Instead, I had become the scapegoat. I was the one blamed for the network glitches, the slowdowns, the unexpected technical failures that no one seemed to understand. And now, the worst part was that Jason had fired me, but he still didn't know the most important thing. He still didn't understand that I was the system. The meeting was scheduled for 15 minutes. That alone told me everything. Meetings that change lives are never given time. They're compressed, contained, made small so the people making the decision don't have to sit with it for too long. I arrived early. The conference room was empty except for a glass jug of water and 2 untouched glasses placed neatly in the center of the table. The blinds were half open, letting in a gray afternoon light that made the room feel colder than it actually was. I chose the chair closest to the wall. Not because I was nervous. Because I liked to see the whole room. When my boss walked in, he didn't sit right away. He stood for a moment, flipping through his tablet, pretending to review notes that had already been decided without me. That pause wasn't for preparation. It was for courage. "Arya," he finally said, clearing his throat. "We need to talk about the startup." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence do the work for me. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable now that I wasn't rushing to fill the space. The startup had been the company's obsession for months. A fast-tracked product. A rushed launch. A promise made to investors before the infrastructure was ready to carry it. Everyone wanted speed. No one wanted stability. "You know we've been having issues," he continued, choosing the word carefully. "Delays. System outages. Integration failures. I nodded slowly. I had warned him about every single one. In writing. With timestamps. With projected consequences. But warnings don't matter when leadership is already emotionally invested in a narrative. He finally sat down. That was when I knew. This conversation wasn't about solving anything. It was about assigning blame. We've decided to move in a different direction, he said. A direction that requires less friction. Less friction. That's what competence becomes when it's inconvenient. He kept talking, but his words blurred into something familiar, corporate language designed to sound reasonable while doing something deeply unfair. He told me the startup couldn't afford instability. He told me investors were nervous. He told me confidence mattered more than caution. And then he said it. We're letting you go. Not shouted. Not emphasized. Just placed on the table between us like a sealed envelope. For a moment, the room was very quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. The distant sound of keyboards outside the glass walls. Life continuing, completely unaware that a decision had just been made that would quietly dismantle everything they were trying to build. You're firing me, I said calmly, not as a question. He nodded, relieved that I'd said it for him. For the IT issues, he added quickly. For the instability around the startup. I looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He was impatient. And impatience is far more dangerous in leadership. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. Because defending yourself assumes the other person is still listening. He wasn't. Instead, I asked one question. Who takes over the systems? He blinked. We'll redistribute responsibilities, he said. We have capable people. I nodded again. That answer told me everything. They hadn't planned this. They had reacted. And reaction is never a strategy. Security will walk you out, he added, almost as an afterthought. Standard procedure. Of course it was. I stood slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I gathered my notebook, the one that contained years of architectural decisions no one else had ever bothered to read. As I walked toward the door, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. They hadn't removed a problem. They had removed a constraint. And constraints are the only thing keeping ambitious systems from collapsing under their own weight. As the door closed behind me, I understood something with perfect certainty. This wasn't the end of my role in that startup. It was the beginning of their eviction. They just didn't know it yet. The first day after I was fired, nothing happened. That's important. No emergency calls. No frantic emails. No sudden realization. Just silence. Silence is often mistaken for resolution. In corporate spaces, it's interpreted as closure. I knew better. Silence isn't the absence of activity. It's the absence of awareness. I stayed home that morning. Not out of shock. Not out of grief. Out of intention. I made coffee slowly. Sat by the window. Watched the city move at a pace that felt strangely disconnected from what was unfolding behind those office walls. I didn't log into anything. I didn't check internal dashboards. I didn't monitor systems. Not because I couldn't. Because I didn't need to. Systems don't forget who built them. They don't panic when a person leaves. They simply wait for permission. Inside the company, my absence was interpreted exactly the way I expected. As compliance. As acceptance. As someone who had been handled. The internal announcement went out mid-morning. Brief. Polished. Neutral. Arya is no longer with the company. We thank her for her contributions and wish her the best. That was it. No explanation. No transition plan. Just a clean sentence meant to erase complexity. Meetings continued. Slack messages kept flowing. The startup team pushed forward. They reassigned tasks casually, as if moving boxes between desks. Someone inherited access they didn't fully understand. Someone else took ownership of systems they had never touched. Confidence filled the gaps where knowledge should have been. That's how fragile structures survive for a while. They rely on momentum. By the second day, I received my first message. Not from leadership. From a developer. Short. Careful. Hey Arya, quick question. Do you know who handles the deployment approvals now? I read it once. Then again. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because answering would have solved a problem they needed to experience. That's the difference between fixing and teaching. Inside the startup, optimism was still intact. They framed my departure as a reset. A chance to move faster. A chance to simplify. Simplification is what people call complexity they don't understand. They removed steps. They bypassed checks. They made decisions based on what looked efficient. The system responded politely. No errors. No warnings. Just delays. Small ones. Barely noticeable. A task that normally completed in minutes took longer. A process that usually resolved automatically stayed pending. Nothing alarming enough to stop a meeting. Nothing dramatic enough to cause concern. Yet, this is where most companies fail. They wait for noise. They don't listen for resistance. By the third day, the startup missed its first internal milestone. Not publicly. Internally. A quiet shift in a shared timeline document. A date nudged forward. No explanation attached. Leadership didn't panic. They rationalized. Growing pains. Post-transition friction. Normal startup chaos. Those phrases are comforting because they postpone responsibility. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Questions began moving sideways instead of upward. Developers asked each other instead of managers. Managers asked teams instead of leadership. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. They didn't know who had authority anymore. And authority doesn't announce its absence. It reveals itself slowly, through hesitation. By the end of the week, I received another message. This one from someone higher up. More formal. Hi Arya, hope you're well. Just checking in, do you have any documentation on the startup's final approval process? I stared at the screen for a long time. Documentation. That was always the part they ignored. I closed the message without replying. Not because I was angry. Because the question itself meant the silence was working. At home, my days remained quiet. Intentionally so. I went on long walks. I let hours pass without interruption. I allowed time to do what confrontation never could. Pressure builds when nothing moves. And nothing was moving anymore. Inside the company, leadership began scheduling more meetings. Longer ones. Meetings meant to restore control. But meetings don't move systems. Authorization does. And authorization had been removed without replacement. They had evicted me from the company. But they had not evicted my decisions. Those were still embedded. Waiting. Unchanged. That's the part they hadn't understood yet. They thought silence meant surrender. In reality, silence was strategy. And strategy doesn't reveal itself until the moment it's irreversible. The first real problem didn't announce itself as a failure. It arrived disguised as a question. A simple one. Why is this still pending? That question appeared in a project channel late one afternoon, buried between routine updates and casual emojis. At first, no one treated it as urgent. Pending items were normal. Temporary. Expected. Someone replied with confidence. Probably just a delay. We'll circle back. They always say that when they don't know what they're looking at. By the next morning, the question was still there. So was the status. Pending. No error message. No red alert. Just waiting. Inside the startup, leadership meetings grew longer. Less celebratory. More careful. Slides were revisited. Timelines were adjusted again, this time with a little more hesitation. The language changed. On track became nearly ready. Ready to launch became in final review. Those phrases are not progress. They're stall tactics. The startup had been built on velocity, on the belief that momentum itself could compensate for incomplete understanding. As long as things moved, no one asked too many questions. But now, things weren't moving. And when motion stops inside a company that depends on growth, fear begins to seep in quietly. A senior engineer raised a concern during a meeting. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to register. We're waiting on approval for the deployment pipeline. Do we know who signs off now? There it was. The question leadership had been avoiding. No one answered immediately. Not because they were afraid, because no one knew. A manager finally spoke. "We'll identify the right person." That sentence did a lot of work. It bought time. It avoided responsibility. It suggested control without proving it. But identifying authority after removing it is not a process. It's improvisation. Behind the scenes, shortcuts began appearing. Temporary permissions. Manual overrides. Workarounds that looked clever on the surface, but introduced instability beneath. The system tolerated them at first. Systems always do. They are designed to assume competence. But tolerance is not endorsement. The startup missed another internal milestone. This time, someone noticed. An investor asked a question during a routine update call. Nothing aggressive. Just curious. "Has the launch window shifted?" Leadership smiled. Reassured. Promised alignment. But the smile was thinner now. That afternoon, I received another message. This one longer. More carefully written. "Arya, hope you're doing well. We're doing an internal review and realize there might be some dependencies you handled directly. Would you be open to a quick call?" I read it slowly. Then I read it again. They still thought this was a conversation. They still believed access could be restored through politeness. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted leverage, but because I already had it. The pressure inside the startup began to shift direction. Upward. Leadership stopped blaming teams. Teams stopped blaming systems. Everyone started looking toward the decision that started it all. The firing. But corporate environments don't like looking backward. They prefer forward-facing explanations. So instead, leadership doubled down. They announced revised timelines, held motivational meetings, talked about resilience. Resilience is often what people preach when accountability feels dangerous. Behind the words, something more important was happening. Compliance checks began to fail. Not dramatically. Subtly. A document waiting for approval that no one could grant. A process designed to require independence now blocked by internal shortcuts. The startup wasn't broken. It was paused. Paused by design. Paused because authority had been removed without replacement. Paused because the system still respected the rules, even when leadership didn't. At home, my phone remained quiet. I didn't chase updates. I didn't monitor progress. I didn't need to. This phase was inevitable. This was the moment where confidence cracks, not loudly, but structurally. Where leadership realizes the problem isn't technical. It's architectural. And architecture doesn't bend to urgency. By the end of the week, the word temporary disappeared from internal conversations. It was replaced with something far more dangerous. Unclear. Unclear ownership. Unclear approval paths. Unclear next steps. And when clarity disappears inside a startup built on speed, momentum doesn't slow. It collapses inward. Quietly. Deliberately. Exactly as designed. The moment outside pressure enters a company, everything changes. Internal confusion can be managed. Internal mistakes can be reframed. Internal delays can be hidden behind optimism. External scrutiny cannot. It arrived quietly. An email forwarded too many times. A subject line that looked harmless enough. Follow up on compliance review. At first, leadership treated it as routine. A checkbox. A formality. Something to be acknowledged and resolved quickly. That was the instinct that had guided every decision so far. Quick fixes. Fast answers. Minimal disruption. But compliance doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to documentation. And documentation has memory. Inside the startup, conversation shifted tone again. People stopped speaking in generalities. They began asking for names. Who approved this? Who signed off on that? Who owns this process now? The answers were inconsistent. Sometimes confident. Sometimes hesitant. Sometimes entirely wrong. Legal was looped in. Not because leadership wanted them involved. Because someone had to explain why deadlines were slipping without visible cause. Legal teams don't panic. They observe. They ask questions slowly, methodically, without emotion. They look for patterns. And the first pattern they noticed was absence. A missing name. A role that had once existed, clearly defined, now left unassigned. The system still expected it. The company no longer acknowledged it. That gap mattered far more than anyone realized. A compliance officer requested a meeting, not with the startup team, with leadership, not to accuse, to clarify. The meeting lasted longer than expected. When it ended, no announcement followed, no reassurance, just a subtle shift in posture. Leadership stopped using words like delay and started using words like risk. Risk is what people say when optimism finally runs out. Meanwhile, inside the systems, processes continued doing exactly what they were designed to do. They waited. They rejected incomplete submissions. They logged activity without escalation. No alarms. No errors. Just refusal. Not defiance. Compliance. That distinction is everything. I learned about the meeting the same way I learned about most things by then. Indirectly. A message from someone I used to work with. Carefully worded. Hey Arya, random question. Do you remember how the startup's approval chain was structured for third-party integrations? I didn't respond. Not because I was hiding. Because the answer wouldn't help anymore. By the time compliance enters a conversation, it's already too late for memory. Only records matter. Inside the company, the atmosphere changed. Meetings became shorter. Voices quieter. People stopped interrupting each other. That's when you know fear has replaced confidence. Someone finally suggested bringing me back. Not formally. Casually. As if proximity could solve structural absence. We could consult her, a manager said. Just temporarily. Legal didn't respond. They didn't need to. Temporary solutions don't satisfy permanent obligations. The compliance review moved forward. Documentation was requested. Approvals were cross-checked. Timelines were examined. And then, inevitably, a question surfaced that no one could answer cleanly. Who had final authority over the startup's operational approvals? Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Professional silence. The kind where everyone knows the answer, but no one wants to say it out loud. Because saying it would mean acknowledging the decision that caused this. The firing. By now, investors were no longer asking about timelines. They were asking about exposure. About liability. About oversight. Those questions don't get deferred. They escalate. Leadership attempted damage control. They reassigned titles. Updated org charts. Issued internal memos that looked decisive but changed nothing. Because authority is not a label. It's a function. And that function had been removed without understanding what depended on it. At home, I remained still. Not disengaged. Not detached. Simply absent. That absence had become its own form of presence. I didn't need to act. I didn't need to interfere. The company was now facing something far more dangerous than an internal failure. They were facing institutional consequence. And institutions don't negotiate. They don't rush. They don't care who feels responsible. They only care about what exists on record. By the end of the week, the startup wasn't just delayed. It was frozen. Not canceled. Not shut down. Suspended. Pending review. Pending clarification. Pending authority. And that is the most expensive state a company can be in. Because nothing moves. And everything bleeds. Quietly. Continuously. Exactly as designed. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It never does. Control doesn't vanish in dramatic gestures. It erodes in fragments. In pauses. In moments where decisions used to be easy and suddenly aren't. Inside the company, leadership stopped making promises. That was the first sign. They still spoke. Still attended meetings. Still presented updates. But the confidence was gone. Every sentence now carried conditions. Assuming approval. Pending review. Once compliance clears. Language became defensive. Careful. Fragile. The startup team felt it immediately. They weren't told anything directly. No announcement. No explanation. They simply noticed that nothing they built could move forward. Code sat waiting. Integrations stalled. Partnership conversations were paused, temporarily, a word that had now lost all meaning. People began to ask different questions. Not about features. Not about launch. But about accountability. Who was responsible if this failed? Who signed off on the decisions that brought them here? Those questions didn't have answers leadership was willing to give, because answering them meant tracing the chain backward. And that chain ended with a choice that could no longer be undone. The firing. A senior executive requested a private session with legal. Not to argue. To understand exposure. That's the moment panic becomes calculation. Legal didn't speculate. They outlined. They explained what the company could and could not do. What could be amended? What could not? What actions would raise red flags? What actions would trigger audits? Most importantly, they explained what could not be retroactively fixed. Authority. You can't rewrite approval after the fact. You can't invent oversight once it's missing. You can't explain away a system that followed its own rules precisely. By now, the startup had missed external benchmarks. Not loudly. Quietly. An expected update didn't arrive. Timelines turned red. And the words temporary hold began appearing in documents that were never meant to slow down. The project hadn't failed yet, but it had stopped moving. And once something that large stops, restarting it requires more than confidence. It requires permission. The first sign wasn't an announcement. It was a revision. A line item quietly adjusted in a financial forecast. A projection that no longer assumed growth, only containment. Inside the company, finance teams began running parallel models. One optimistic. One realistic. One silent. The silent one was the one leadership asked to see twice. Cash flow timelines shortened. Burn rates were recalculated without the startup's promised return. Expenses once justified as investment were now reclassified as exposure. No one said the word failure. They didn't have to. Numbers are blunt in a way language never is. They don't negotiate. They don't care about intention. They simply reveal what's already true. The startup had been positioned as the company's next chapter. Its valuation assumptions were woven into long-term planning, hiring decisions, marketing spend, infrastructure expansion. All of it assumed momentum. Now, momentum had vanished. And without momentum, projections collapse inward. The board requested an update. Not a presentation. An explanation. That distinction matters. Presentations sell. Explanations defend. Leadership prepared carefully. They framed delays as caution. They emphasized regulatory diligence. They spoke about strategic patience. But the questions that followed weren't interested in narrative. They were interested in control. Who currently authorizes operational decisions? When did that change? Why wasn't the board informed? Those questions don't exist in isolation. They echo. They linger. They reshape trust. Somewhere between the second and third board call, the startup disappeared from official language. It wasn't removed. It was rephrased. From launch initiative to internal review. From core growth driver to experimental vertical. From certainty to contingency. Inside the company, morale shifted again. This time downward. Teams stopped asking when things would resume. They started asking where they would be reassigned. Careers pivoted quietly. People protect themselves long before companies protect them. I heard about these changes through fragments. A forwarded message. A resigned tone in a voice memo someone sent me by mistake. A LinkedIn update that arrived too early to be coincidence. I didn't feel triumph. That's important. This wasn't satisfaction. It was recognition. Recognition that systems, when built correctly, don't need enforcement. They simply wait for misalignment to expose itself. Legal finalized their assessment. Not publicly. Internally. They concluded what I already knew. The startup could not be restarted without reopening decisions leadership had already closed. Reopening them would require scrutiny. Scrutiny would require accountability. Accountability would require admissions. And admissions would cost far more than the startup itself. So leadership made the only decision left. They didn't fight the system. They complied with it. Funding was paused. Resources were redirected. The startup was removed from strategic roadmaps without ceremony. No announcement. No closure. Just absence. That's how companies bury mistakes. Not with noise. With silence. By the time employees noticed, the future had already been rewritten. The startup still technically existed. On paper. In archived documents. In dashboards, no one checked anymore. But functionally, it was gone. Evicted. Not shut down. Not dismantled. Simply excluded from relevance. At home, I reflected on how clean it all was. No confrontation. No accusations. No need for vindication. They had fired me for instability. And in doing so, removed the only stabilizing force they had. That irony wasn't poetic. It was structural. The most expensive lessons are never dramatic. They're administrative. They happen in spreadsheets, in meeting minutes, in decisions no one remembers making. By now, the outcome was irreversible. The startup would not return. The company would absorb the loss quietly. Leadership would survive. They always do. But something else had been lost. Confidence. Not public confidence. Internal confidence. The kind that allows companies to move decisively. That kind doesn't come back easily. And it never comes back unchanged. By the time the final decisions were made, no one called them decisions anymore. They were referred to as adjustments. That's how companies soften endings. They don't say something failed. They say it evolved. They don't say something was lost. They say it was reprioritized. Inside the executive floor, the startup no longer had a champion. That was the most important change. Projects don't die when they stop working. They die when no one is willing to attach their name to them. In meetings, its mention became optional. Someone would bring it up cautiously. Another person would redirect. And the conversation would move on. That's how relevance disappears. Legal finalized the last internal memo. Not a warning. Not a confession. A summary. It outlined what actions were complete, what risks remained, and what questions should never be reopened. It recommended distance. Distance from timelines. Distance from accountability. Distance from the decision that had removed authority without replacing it. Leadership accepted the memo without edits. That told me everything. They weren't interested in understanding anymore. They were interested in surviving intact. The company issued internal updates that sounded optimistic on the surface. Refocusing on core strengths. Streamlining operations. Aligning leadership priorities. None of those phrases mentioned the startup. They didn't have to. Everyone already knew. Teams were reassigned. Roles were quietly dissolved. Budgets were reduced without explanation. The startup didn't end. It faded. And fading is far more effective than confrontation. I watched from a distance. Not with satisfaction. With detachment. There's a difference. Satisfaction seeks acknowledgement. Detachment doesn't need it. I saw how quickly people adapted. How easily narratives changed. How the same leaders who once spoke passionately about innovation now spoke calmly about discipline. Companies don't mourn their mistakes. They absorb them. And they move forward as if nothing happened. Except something always remains. A hesitation. A second thought before decisive action. A reluctance to move as fast as they once did. That's the real cost. The startup had promised momentum. What it delivered instead was caution. For me, closure didn't arrive through apology or recognition. It arrived through clarity. I understood, finally, that my role had never been respected because it had never been fully understood. They hadn't fired me because I failed. They fired me because my presence slowed decisions they didn't want questioned. That realization settled quietly. It didn't hurt. It explained everything. I closed the last thread connecting me to that chapter. Archived old documents. Deleted lingering access requests. Not out of spite. Out of completeness. The company would continue. Smaller. More careful. Less ambitious. But intact. The startup would be remembered only in fragments. In presentations that never made it past draft. In resumes that described it vaguely. In lessons no one publicly acknowledged learning. And I moved on. Not because I won. But because the system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It revealed the truth. Not loudly. Not immediately. But permanently. Companies don't announce their mistakes. They just feel them later. This story wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because quiet systems always outlast loud decisions. If you stayed until the end, you understand something most people don't. This wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about revenge in the obvious sense. It was about patience, structure, and timing. Stories like this don't happen on the surface. They happen quietly inside systems, decisions, and moments people underestimate. If you appreciate calm, intelligent corporate stories like this, stories about being fired, workplace injustice, power dynamics, and consequences that unfold without noise, then subscribe to this channel. New stories like this are coming. Thanks for listening. See you next time.